Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Samach Zayin Amud Beis, 67b of Maseches Kiddushin. We are starting 7 lines down on the page. In the middle of the line, first word on the line is Tana, and in the middle it says Gufa. Whenever the Gemara says Gufa, it means it's going to quote something that it previously brought in for another proof of something or a question, but now it wants to examine. Gufa means it itself. It wants to examine this discussion itself, and that's what it's going to do. So says the Gemara, Gufa, Ki Asa Ravin Amar Rabbi Yochanan. We learned last week, when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael, from Israel to Bavel, to Babylonia, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Be'umos halech achar azachar. For the nations of the world, you follow the father, you follow the male. So if two different nations marry, the man is from one nation, the woman is from another nation, and they didn't convert. They're not Jewish, and they have a child. What nation is that child from? He follows the father's nation, right? And there are practical differences in the different nations, different halachos that apply to different nations. But if niskairu, if they converted, so then halech achar apagum shebeshneim, then you go by the one that's of diminished status of the two of them. So we know that there's, as we learned last week, there are certain nations that even after they convert, they still are limited in their ability to marry other Jews. So depending on the generation, different factors. So if two different nations, if two converts from two different nations convert, and each one has or doesn't have is one of those nations that has one of these special halachos that apply to it, so you go by whichever one is of the diminished status. So the Gemara is now going to explain how that works. So, my be'umos alech achar azachar. What does it mean that amongst the nations we go by the male, we go by the father? Kid Tanya, like we learning a brisa, minayin la'echad min ha'umos sheba la'knanis. How do we know that if a man from a different nation had relations with a Canaanite woman, the Holid Ben, and they had a son, Shata Rashai Liknoso Be'eved, that one is permitted to buy that son as a slave? If the person is from one of the Canaanite nations, so then when the Jewish people arrived in Israel, they were commanded not to allow any of the Canaanite nations to live. They were commanded to destroy them, and so what will we consider if a man from a different nation married a Canaanite woman? What is the status of that child? So you are allowed to purchase them as a slave, meaning there's no prohibition to let them live, meaning you're allowed to let them live. So. And they're not considered Canaanite. Talmud Lomar, v'gam mibnei atoshavim hagarim imachem mehem tiknu. The way that we know that is, the way we know that the child in this case would follow the father and not be considered like his Canaanite mother, is because the verse says that also from amongst, it says that after you come to the land and it talks about purchasing slaves, it says that as well, mibnei atoshavim hagarim imachem, from the dwellers amongst you, mehem tiknu, you can buy from them. So there are cases where you'd be able to purchase from those dwelling in the land of Canaan, and what it would be adding is that of course, if they're from other nations, why not? Why couldn't you purchase from them? The pasuk just told us previously that's permitted. So what's this adding? That also from those who dwell amongst you can purchase. So it means this type of case where the father is from another nation, the mother is from Canaan. You'd be allowed to purchase that child. There's in that society, but there's no requirement to destroy them like there was for the people of Canaan. Yachol af eved sheba al shivcha min ha'umos. So you might think that the same is true for, that's the Girsa that it says in our Gemara, but it should say Yachol af Kenani sheba al achas min ha'umos. You might think the same is true if the father is a Kenani and he had relations with a woman from another nation, that there too, the holy parent, they had a child, that you're allowed to purchase that person as a slave and there's no requirement to wipe them out like there is for the people of Canaan. So, Talmud Lomar, Asher Holidu Ba'artzachem. So that's why the Torah says, those that give birth in your land, when we say that in that previous same verse that we previously purchased, so the verse goes like this. Before that verse, actually, we should just mention, it says, and your slave and your maidservant that you'll have from amongst the nations that are around you, that are not from the 7 nations, you can purchase from them. And then it says, and also from those who dwell amongst you, mehem tiktu, you can buy from them, umi mishpachtam asher imachem, and from their families that are amongst you, asher holidu ba'artzachem, that have given birth in your land. So we said that would come to include even those who dwell in the land of Canaan, meaning if the father was from another nation and came to dwell, marry a Canaanite woman, so you'd be able to buy that person as a slave and you would not have to destroy them. However, the other case, the opposite case, where the father is from Canaan and the mother is from another nation, so there you would not be allowed to, because it says, Asher holidu b'artzachem, those who give birth in your land, meaning those who, min hanoladim b'artzachem, those who give birth, but lo min hagarim b'artzachem, not just those who dwell, meaning those who give birth, meaning the women, it's from their offspring, the Canaanite women's offspring, where the father's not a Canaanite, those you'd be allowed to buy as a slave and would not have, and there's no prohibition of letting them live, and but not those who dwell there, meaning not if the father is a Canaanite, so then you would not be able to let them live. Again, this means, by the way, if for those Canaanites who would not give up the land of Israel for the Jewish people when they came, then there was a prohibition to not let them remain alive in Israel unless they left. Okay. Then we said, and we continue to examine the same teachings, nisgairu, but if they convert, so then the status of the 2 converts, the child follows the pagum, the one with more diminished status. So b'mai, what are we talking about here? Who is the father? Who is the mother? What's the scenario that this would come up? Ilema b'mitzri shnasa amonis. Maybe you'll say if the father's a Mitzri and the mother is from the nation of Ammon. So, as we learned last week, so the Egyptian converts are forbidden to marry into the Jewish people until the 3rd generation. And the same is for Edom, for Edomites. Moab and Ammon, the Torah says, even the 10th generation can't marry in. However, over there we have a drasha we learn out, it's Moavi v'lo Moavis. It's a male Moabite but not a female. And Ammoni v'lo Ammonis, a male Ammonite and not a female Ammonite. So what's the case here that we're talking about where the 2 converts marry each other, that we go by the pagum one? So, if you tell me that it's a Mitzri, the father was Egyptian convert, Shenasa Ammonis, and he married, the mother was an Ammonite convert. So then, my pagumiko, why would we say that you go after the one that's more pagum, that's more of diminished status? In other words, there's an implication here that we're talking about where they both have a pagum status, they both have a diminished status, and it's telling you which one you go by. In some situations you go by this one, that one, depending on which one's more pagum in the given situation. Well, a Ammonite woman who converts is not pagum at all, she's not diminished at all. She's, like we said, Ammoni v'lo Ammonis. Only an Ammoni is of diminished status. A male convert from Ammon is diminished status. He can't marry a regular Jewish girl. But an Ammonite female convert, she's fully in because she can marry. The prohibition doesn't apply to her. So that can't be the case that we're talking about because we wouldn't call that pogrom. She's not of diminished status. So Ella be'amoni shenasa mitzris. What we must be talking about, where this would come up, is if a Ammonite male convert marries a Egyptian, a mitzris female convert. Because then, when it comes to the prohibition of marrying an Egyptian until the third generation, it applies even to women. So then we can say, V'i zachar have, if the child is a male, Shadya basrei didei, then he'll follow the father. Meaning, what would be the worst, the most pogrom, the most diminished, if the child is a male? It's if he's an Ammoni rather than a Mitri. If he was a Mitri, he can marry in the third generation. An Ammoni can never marry into a regular Jew. So therefore, if we say halech achar pogrom, you follow the more diminished status, that would be of the father, and he would be considered a Ammonite. And he could never marry a regular Jew. But if the child is a female, Shadia Abasra Dido, so then she'll follow the mother. Because if she follows her father, that means she's an Ammonite. An Ammonite is not of diminished status if it's a woman. So that wouldn't be following the pogrom. Following the one of diminished status in this case would be, if we consider her a mitzvah, we consider her an Egyptian, then she would not be, she's not allowed to marry until the third generation, and that is the halacha that we follow the more pogrom, the one of the more diminished status. Okay, now the Gemara returns to the Mishnah, and we go to the third rule of the Mishnah. So you might recall in the Mishnah in Samach Vav Amud Beis 66b, we had a number of rules for establishing the status of the children. We said if there's Kiddushin and there's no Aveira, it's a permitted marriage, the child follows the father. If there's a Kiddushin and there's an Aveira, though it's a prohibited marriage, so then the child follows the pogrom, follows the parent of diminished status. And then it said, anywhere where there's no Kiddushin, but the woman could technically have Kiddushin with someone else because she's Jewish, but in this case there's no Kiddushin because there's some prohibition that doesn't allow Kiddushin to even take effect. So then the child is a mamzer. So ask the Gemara, Mina hani mili, from where do we know this? And what it's really asking is not how we know that the child is a mamzer. That we know from elsewhere. From a different set of verses. The question here is, how do we know that Kiddushin doesn't take effect? How do we know that in a situation where a man tries to marry a woman who he's forbidden to, and that prohibition is more than just a lav, more than just a regular negative commandment, it's a chiyuv kares. It's a prohibition that would lead to kares, or death penalty, or something like that. How do we know that Kiddushin won't even take effect? So that's what we're addressing. So the Gemara explains to Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Umatu ba mishum de Rabbi Yanai v'Rav Acha brei de Rava. Some say it was in the name of Rabbi Yanai and Rav Acha, the son of Rava. Umatu ba mishum Rabbi Yossi Aglili. And some say it was from Rabbi Yossi Aglili. But what's the teaching? Amar Kra, the pasuk says, the verse says, V'yatzami beiso, v'halcha v'yisa li'ish acher. This is talking about a woman who gets divorced. It says she'll leave his house, and she'll go and she'll be to another man. So the implication is that we're talking about where she goes and marries another man. It says li'ish acher, to another man. What do we mean another man? La'acherim v'lo l'krovim. Specifically, it has to be acherim, it has to be others, but not relatives of her husband, so or of herself. In other words, all those relatives that are prohibited to marry, she can't marry because, it's saying she'll go and become married to a different man. A different man meaning somebody who's not related to her or her husband. One of the prohibited close relatives. Because the implication is that she wouldn't be able to marry them. It wouldn't even take effect. Those are many of the examples of prohibited relationships are her relatives, his relatives, where one would be chayav kares, would receive kares, spiritual excision, and sometimes misa, sometimes death penalty. So that's what we're talking about. So the Gemara asks, Maskif la Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba asked him this, Ve'ema le'acher v'lo leben. How do you know that this is coming to exclude all relatives? Maybe when it says that she'll go and marry another man, it means another man and not a man who's the close relative of her first husband. And that is his son. Maybe it's only excluding that Kiddushin won't take effect with her ex-husband's son. But maybe with other relatives, Kiddushin really does take effect, even though it's prohibited to marry them, but maybe Kiddushin does take effect. How do we know that this excludes other cases from Kiddushin as well? So the Gemara says, Ben behed yaksib be. You don't need a special pasuk to tell me that Kiddushin wouldn't take effect on her husband's son. Because it says explicitly, it says, Lo yikach ish es eshes aviv. A man may not take his father's wife as a wife. A man's father's wife, if you go the other way, it's the wife's ex-husband's son, or husband's son. But that'll be obvious if she's still married, she can't marry the son. But even if she's not married anymore, she's not allowed to marry her husband's son, or in this other direction, a man is not allowed to marry his father's wife, his father's previous wife. So it says he can't, lo yikach, he can't take her. So the implication is it won't even work if he tries to marry her. So we already know that a man can't marry his father's wife, ex-wife. So it wouldn't be coming. So when we say here that the haisalish acher she'll go and she marries someone else, and we'll say that someone else, but she can't marry a close relative, the son. No, we don't need that. We know she can't marry. It won't work to marry the close relative, the son. That's an explicit pasuk. Lo yikach ishes eshes aviv. A man can't marry his father's wife. So acher lamali. So going back to the pasuk, the halcha v'haisalish acher, she'll go and she'll be married to another man. Shma mina la'acherim v'lo l'krovim. That will teach me she should go and marry another man who's an acher, who's distant, but not somebody who's a close relative, because it won't work to marry a close relative. Ask the Gemara v'ema idi v'idi leben. No, 1 second. Maybe they're both talking about specifically her marrying her husband's son, and halichatchila v'hadiyavid. Maybe one is telling you that lichatchila ideally meaning it's prohibited to marry him, and the other one is telling you that it won't even work. In other words, the pasuk that says that a man can't marry his father's wife, it says, Lo yikach ishes eshes aviv. A man should not take his father's wife. But who says it doesn't work if he does? Maybe I would have thought it does work. He can't do it, but if he did it, the Kiddushin would take effect. So that's lechatchila. Ideally he shouldn't, meaning the halacha says he shouldn't. But b'diavad, if he did try, if he gave her Kiddushin, maybe I would think it would still take effect. Maybe that's why I need our pasuk, the halcha v'haisalish acher. She should go and marry somebody else, but not her husband's son, because it won't work to marry her husband's son. But maybe it's limited to that, and really other prohibitions, maybe the Kiddushin would work, it would take effect. Says the Gemara, no. L'chatchila me'achos isha nafka. Now I already can learn out that l'chatchila, that ideally it's prohibited for a man to marry his father's wife, or for a woman to marry her husband's son. I can learn it from achos isha. Achos isha means the sister of one's wife. So if a man was married and then even when he's still married, he's not allowed to marry his wife's sister. Even after he gets divorced, if she's still alive, if his ex-wife is still alive, he can't marry her sister. And we can learn from there, just like Kiddushin doesn't take effect over there, it won't take effect on, just like the over there one lechatchila isn't supposed to do it, so too by the son, as follows. Gemara says, Umachos isha bikaris lo tikadesh, if an achos isha, if the sister of one's wife, which, if they would have relations, the prohibition would be kares. The punishment would be kares. Still, lo tikadesh, he's not allowed to even give her kiddushin. Right? Forget about relations. He's not allowed to give her kiddushin. How do we know that? Because the pasuk says, Rashi quotes the pasuk, lo sikach, he shouldn't take her, which implies he shouldn't even give her kiddushin. So chayve misos beisting lo kol shekain, somebody who would get the death penalty, isn't it all the more so that he lechatchila he shouldn't try to marry her, shouldn't try to give her kiddushin? So, in other words, achos isha, if a man marries his wife's sister, so the punishment is kares. It's a spiritual excision, which this Gemara considers less severe than misa and beis din, being killed by the court, and therefore we can make a kal v'chomer. We can learn it logically a fortiori. If achos isha, a man's wife's sister, where if they would have relations, the punishment would be kares. And yet it says, lo sikach, don't take her as a wife, don't give her kiddushin. That lechatchila, you're not allowed to give her kiddushin. So, a man to his father's wife, which is not just kares, it's more severe even, the human court would kill him for that. So there, again, the Torah prohibits them to have relations, so wouldn't we know all the more so lechatchila, he shouldn't give her kiddushin? So if that's the case, so then I already know that lechatchila he shouldn't give her kiddushin, and so when the Torah then says about him lo yikach, he shouldn't take her, I know he shouldn't take her as kiddushin. I can learn that from a kal v'chomer. So what's it adding? It must be adding, it won't even work if he tried it. It won't even work if he tried it. Which brings us back to where we were before. That means that I do have an explicit pasuk teaching me that when it comes to the son of one's husband, there is already a pasuk saying that kiddushin won't take effect. It won't even take effect. And I don't need the pasuk that we're dealing with to teach me that. The pasuk that we're dealing with by divorce, where it says the holcha v'haisel shachar shall go and marry another man, I don't need that to teach me that kiddushin doesn't take effect for the son. So what's it teaching me? It must be teaching me that it doesn't take effect for any relatives. So that's our source at the moment, that we're back to that as the source, that kiddushin won't take effect for any of the prohibited relatives. Ask the Gemara, Ve'ema idi v'idi b'achos isha, halachatchila hadiyabed. But wait a second. Maybe that's also talking about achos isha, the sister of one's wife. Even though I do have a pasuk that says, I have a verse that says, lo yikach, don't take her, but maybe that meant lechatchila. Ideally, you're not supposed to take her. It's prohibited to try to give her kiddushin, but who says it won't work if he did? Maybe I need our pasuk to teach me that. V'holcha v'haisel ishacher. He should go and marry another, she'll go and marry another man, and we say, la'acher acherim v'lo l'krovin, but instead of saying that, don't say to another man, but not to any relative. Say, to another one, but not to his sister's wife, or in her case, her sister's husband. And why would I think that it's specifically talking about that one relative? Because once the Torah says explicitly, don't take her, lechatchila lo sikach, so then it makes sense that when it then has a teaching that Kiddushin won't even take effect, it would go on the one that it said, lechatchila, don't take it. A man should not take his wife's sister as a wife. And then we have this additional pasuk teaching me, and if he tries, it won't even work. So the Gemara says, Eina chanami. The Gemara says, actually, you're right. That's all we would be able to learn from this pasuk. We would be limited to that. The halcha b'haisal ishach, she should go and marry another man, but not her close relative, meaning specifically not the husband of her sister, because there Kiddushin wouldn't take effect. But that's all I know. All I know is that Kiddushin doesn't take effect on her of a man to his wife's sister. I said husband's sister. I meant husband's wife before. But all we know is that Kiddushin won't take effect from a man to his wife's sister. We also know from before that it also won't take effect from a man to his father's wife. But all other relatives we don't know. So that's the Gemara is going to now bring up. And it says, Ashkechar achos isha. So we now have a place where we know that Kiddushin doesn't even take effect for the sister of one's wife, but shar arayos minalam. But how do we know that it doesn't take effect on other arayos, other prohibited relationships? Says the Gemara, Yalfinan me achos isha. We can learn them from achos isha, from a sister's wife. Ma achos isha. Just like the prohibition to marry one's, not sister's wife, wife's sister. Just like the prohibition to marry one's wife's sister. Miuchedeshi erva. First of all, it's considered an erva. It says don't reveal the nakedness. And v'chayaving as dona karis. And it's chayiv karis. The prohibition, the punishment is spiritual excision. V'ashigigas achatas. And if done by accident, it would be a carbon chatas, a sin offering. V'lo tafsi ba Kiddushin, and there we say Kiddushin doesn't take effect. So av kol shi erva. So all the things it would follow, we have a concept of binyan av. If we have certain parameters, and we have other cases that fit those parameters, then it follows that they should have the same rule. So if we know that it's true, we have a source for the idea that Kiddushin doesn't take effect on one's wife's sister. So therefore, we can then say that just like that case, it's a case of arayos, and it's a case of karis, and when done by accident, it's chatas. And we know Kiddushin doesn't take effect, so af kol shi erva. So any case that's arayos, v'chayaving as dona karis, v'ashigigas chatas, and that one would be chayav, one would be liable for karis, would be punished with karis, when done on purpose, and chatas, a sin offering when done by accident, lo tafsi ba Kiddushin. Kiddushin shouldn't take effect. All other relatives too, because they fit into the same parameters. So we can learn that Kiddushin doesn't take effect by all of these prohibited relationships from the fact that it doesn't take effect by a wife's sister. Says the Gemara, Bishlam akulo asyan. So almost all the cases make sense. You can learn them out. Ella eshes ish ve'eshes ach. But there's two cases that you shouldn't be able to learn out. And that is, how do we know that Kiddushin doesn't take effect on a married woman? And how do we know that Kiddushin doesn't take effect on eshes ach, on one's brother's wife? Why would those be exceptions to this? Why wouldn't we be able to learn it out? Because ikul mifrach. Because one can refute the comparison and say, Mala achos isha shekein ein la heter b'makom mitzvah. We're trying to learn from achos isha, from the prohibition of marrying one's wife's sister. That if their Kiddushin doesn't take effect, it shouldn't take effect in any of the other arayos. The problem is that there's no heter b'makom mitzvah. There's no case where it would become permitted and because of a mitzvah to marry her. But Tamar ve'eshes ach, as opposed to the wife of one's brother, sheyesh la heter b'makom mitzvah. There's a case where she's allowed to be married and it's a mitzvah. That's if there's yibum. If the brother dies without children, then his wife is supposed to marry the brother. So you can have a man who marries his brother's wife. It's a mitzvah too, even. Yibum. So how could you... That's a more lenient case. There's a case where there's a situation where you're allowed to marry. So since it's overall more lenient and it doesn't follow all the parameters of where we're trying to learn from, the case of achos isha, of the wife of the sister of one's wife, so how can we learn from there? And Eishes Ishnami, also the case of a married woman. Ikol Mifrach. One can ask the following question, refute the comparison. All the other cases, they're never permitted while the one who created the prohibition is still alive. Tamar Beishas Ish, as opposed to a married woman, she could become permitted while the one who prohibited her is still alive. Meaning, who prohibits a woman from marrying anybody else? Her husband, when he gives her Kiddushin. But even while he's alive, she could become permitted. How so? If he gives her a get, if he gives her a divorce. So she could become permitted. So that's a more lenient case. So maybe there, Kiddushin should take effect. You shouldn't be able to learn it from achos isha. Now it's a funny thing to try to suggest that Kiddushin could take effect on a married woman, when Kiddushin, by definition, that's what Kiddushin is. You're Mekadesh. You sanctify, sort of. You dedicate and separate her from other people. But at least in the logical flow of the Gemara, it's suggesting, well, you can't learn it from achos isha. Maybe my logic is correct, but you can't learn it from achos isha. You can't learn it from the fact that Kiddushin doesn't take effect by one's wife's sister, that it shouldn't take effect here. Because this is more lenient. Here, she could become permitted. Now, we'll note, it says specifically while the prohibitor is still alive. See, a wife's sister can also become permitted if the wife passes away. Either before divorce, after divorce, doesn't really matter. But if a man's wife passes away, he's allowed to marry her sister. So there is a case where she becomes permitted, but not while he's still alive. As opposed to a regular married woman can become permitted while her husband's still alive if he gives her a get. So we can't learn it from achos isha, from one's wife's sister. So rather Rabbi Yonah says, V'teimer Rav Huna, B'reit Rav Yoshua, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Kol asher yasem mikol ha'to'evos ha'ela v'nichrasu. It says anybody who does any of these to'evos, any of these abominable relationships, v'nichrasu, they'll get karis, they'll get spiritual excision. So it sums them all up in one verse. Hukshu kol ha'rayos kulam l'achos isha. And what that does is it's makish them all, it compares them all, it equates them all. And now we can say, and it equates them all to achos isha, to the prohibition of a sister's wife. A wife's sister. Ma'achos isha lo tafsi ba kiddushin. Just like by one's wife's sister, Kiddushin doesn't take effect. Af kol harayos kulam lo tafsi ba kiddushin. So to all harayos, Kiddushin doesn't take effect because of this hekish, this comparison, because they're all summed up in one pasuk that teaches us they're all in the same boat. Ask the Gemara, Ihachi, if so, afilu nida nami, even a nida also. A nida, a woman who's menstruating, is forbidden to be with her husband until she purifies herself goes through the purification process, including mikvah. You could be a nida even if you're not married. Any woman who's menstruating becomes tameh, and if a man gives kiddushin to a woman while she's a nida, even if she's single, it shouldn't take effect because they're forbidden to each other at that moment. She's an erva. So why? But Alama Amar Abaye. Why did Abaye say Hakol Me'odim? Everybody agrees. Everybody agrees that if a person has relations with a nida, ve'ala sota, or he has relations with a sota, meaning if he made his wife a sota, and then he had relations with her, the child, is not a mamzer. So, which implies that Kiddushin would take effect. And Sota is already married to him, so that's not what we're talking about. But Nida is not married to him at the moment, possibly. You can have a case, she's a single woman and she's a Nida. And if they would have relations, it says the child is not a mamzer, which also implies that Kiddushin would take effect. But why? she's an erva. She's a forbidden relationship, and we say all arayos, Kiddushin doesn't take effect. So Amar Chizkiya says no, because the pasuk says utehi nidasa alav, and her status of nida should be upon him. That's the pasuk saying if he has relations with her, then her status of nida will be upon him. She'll make him tameh. But what we learn from the word vitehi, which is an interesting word, that afilu b'shas nidasa teheba havaya. What it's teaching me is that tehi, tehi is like the same root as the word havaya, which means to come to. That even when she's a nida, she could come to him, meaning not permitted, but that Kiddushin could take effect. There's havaya, there's coming, there's a possibility for coming in for Kiddushin to take effect. So there's a special nida is an exception. It's true. It's one of the arayos. It's a forbidden relationship, and it's chayav kares. It's a prohibition of kares. However, if he gives her Kiddushin, it will still take effect. That's an exception, and that's because of this special verse, utehi nidasa alav. Okay, next time we'll continue this comparison.